Thank you. All right, I'm going to begin today with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land on which I am meeting you from, the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Now, for everyone who I have not yet met, my name is Erin Gemantis and I manage the Anti-Puppy Farm Legal Clinic here at the Animal Law Institute. I'm just going to be our host for today, and I'm going to take us through a series of questions on the topic of puppy farming in Australia, which for me is exceptionally relevant. Okay, so the way we're going to run today's session, obviously this is the first Moot competition we've done online, so we've thought about the best way to do this would be to start with an introduction from each of our panelists about their work and their views or experience with puppy farming and those associated issues. I will then present our panelists with some questions that have been submitted by the public and from some of my colleagues as well. And then following that, I thought we might open the session to the floor if there are any additional questions from people. And you can just use the Zoom hand up function down the bottom of your screen to put your hand up when appropriate. Another final note, obviously this probably goes without saying, but if anyone is, less than respectful to everyone else on the call, you will be removed from the Zoom meeting. Okay, the other option as well is please feel free to leave questions in the chat function if you prefer to ask a question that way. All right, so I'm going to hand over for a quick intro to our first panelist, Georgie Purcell, who is the president of Oscars Law. Thanks, Georgie.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming along. So my name's Georgie Purcell. I'm currently the president of Oscars Law, and I've been involved with the organisation for about 7 years now, and in the president capacity for about 3 years. So Oscars Law is a anti-puppy farming campaigning organisation, and we largely focus on actually political lobbying to change the laws that impact puppy farms across the country. But we also work in the rescue space as well. So we work with a range of rescue groups on taking on puppy farm rescues and rehoming them. A bit of background, I guess, about the work that we've done. My colleague, Deborah Tranter, she first started the campaign to end puppy farms in Victoria in 1992, which is the year that I was born. So I think it sort of really shows just how long this fight has been going. And it was only in 2014 that we actually got a commitment for the first time ever in Australia for a state to implement anti-puppy farm legislation. And those laws passed the Victorian Parliament in 2017. So what they did, we're going to talk about them a little bit later on, but they banned the sale of puppies in pet shops and cracked down on puppy farms. And that really got the ball rolling to get other state governments to look at doing the same. Particularly the Labor Party has been the major party that's shown the most interest in it. And we're about to have the same laws passed in Western Australia. They've already gone through the lower house and they're about to go through the upper house in the coming weeks. And we've got a commitment off Labor in South Australia to do the same if they win the election. So we're really starting to see the momentum on this issue, I guess, at a political level. It's been a long-running fight for us, and previously in Victoria, only years before, when we had a Liberal government, were actually fighting rollbacks in the legislation. They changed the code of practice to allow puppies to be killed and breeding dogs to be killed with things like blunt force trauma, and to not have to have vet visits. So while we focus on actually banning and ending puppy farms, we also really focus on making sure the existing protections that dogs on breeding factories do have wind back even further. Outside of my work with Oscars Law, I guess because I might switch between hats a couple of times in this session, I'm also Chief of Staff to Andy Medic, who's the Animal Justice MP here in the Victorian Parliament. So I do a bit of work on puppy farms in that space as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Georgie. I'm going to hand over to Brett Melke of Melke Legal. Now, Brett is a self-described dog lawyer. Thanks, Brett. Oh, I think you might just be on mute, just down the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to have a little chat and answer some questions. I'm the only full-time animal lawyer, I believe, in Australia. And one thing I note is that I deal with reptile farming and cat farming as well. There are other animals that sadly suffer similar fates, and the reptiles are probably the worst of all. I've been doing this full-time since about 2006. Before then, just did a little bit of it. But look, I could talk for hours on puppy farmers, but I'm one of the few who's actually prosecuted a number of puppy farmers. And I hear every now and then of clients in civil matters complaining of a problematic dog they bought. And the funny thing is that always, every single time, these civil disputes arise where they've bought a dog where the breeder says, oh, no, don't come to my premises. Look, just meet me at the local McDonald's or at the service station and we'll hand over the dog there. Because, of course, they don't want the people to see the conditions in which the puppy was bred. It's a very common scenario, and we really need to encourage people to report those situations a lot more than they do. Sometimes those do result in prosecutions. I was involved in a couple where some really good purchasers decided to call in counsel and get counsel to prosecute. So that was great. But unfortunately, people don't seem to be aware that that's where these puppy farmers are and how they operate. The strange thing with puppy farmers is that with most people you're prosecuting 2 or 3 offences. With the puppy farmers, it's normally between 100 to 400, because if they're bad, they're going to do it full on, and they do. They don't just breach one part of the Code of Practice. They don't just breach one part of the Domestic Animals Act. They breach just everything imaginable. And POCTA, as in Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, normally you've got a few cruelty charges thrown in there as well. So they're fairly extensive, these prosecutions that I've been involved in. But that does lead to a problem that they're expensive to run. And councils in particular, and I think all organisations are a little bit shy of expensive prosecutions. They're shy of enforcement full stop, because they see themselves as having other duties other than just being a prosecutorial agency. These puppy farmers, I've found when prosecuting them, almost never are they mad, they're just plain bad. And they're very calculating in the way they go about things. They're very calculating in the way they deal with us as prosecutors. I did have one case where the prosecuted person was just mad, actually, which I could never get my head around it. He actually thought the conditions he had the dogs in were actually right. But there are some strange people in the world. The problem with these offences is too that puppy farmers can hide, and they hide in rural parts and on the fringes of metropolitan Melbourne, and that makes our job very difficult in prosecuting them. Some of them seem to have gone under the radar for years and years and years and never been picked up by any council or any authority before finally something unusual happens and they get picked up and prosecuted. And then others, very sadly, they have been under the radar of councils, and councils have not inspected them properly. They haven't done a proper audit, not a full audit. It's quite clear to me that they've gone in and they've said, oh, okay, we've attended this place, tick it off, done, that one's inspected, spent 10 minutes there, maybe half an hour, and they haven't gone out the back to see the really bad part where 99% of the puppies are kept. And it's only when they do a proper audit, finally a proper audit going through everything that's on their list, that they sit down and that they go through the premises and find that there are massive breaches. And this is the real problem I see with the puppy farming. The laws have been improved immensely in 2017. That did make a very significant difference. But it's the enforcement that concerns me these days. The willingness of authorities to actually prosecute. And I've copped flack for prosecuting where it's a first-time offender who's come to notice for the first time, and one particular agency had to go at us for doing that. Well, my view on that is it is so hard to find these people that when you find them, you know that it's not the first time they've done this. And it's certainly a deterrent to prosecute them rather than to say, well, they're there, you know, we'll give you a chance, just go back and do what you were doing, and okay, we'll just smooth it over. No. I think you've got to be very proactive with these prosecutions. But look, I could go on for ages. Maybe I should stop now. Look,
right.
my views on it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brett. A lot of interesting information. I think there's a lot of questions there to follow. I might just hand over to our third panellist for an intro. That's Siobhan O'Sullivan, Associate Professor in Social Policy at the University of New South Wales. Thanks, Siobhan.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and it was so nice to see the acknowledgement at the start. I am not a lawyer, so I hope everyone will go easy on me and be a little bit sympathetic towards my situation. When we get into too much nitty-gritty of legal talk, it tends to go a little bit over my head. But I hope I nonetheless do have something to offer the discussion today. I'm a political scientist and I focus on animal welfare policy making. I wrote a book called Animals, Equality and Democracy, and you wouldn't believe the coincidence. I just happen to have a copy here. And in that book, I have a careful look at animal welfare laws in New South Wales. And I make the argument that there is something about an animal's level of visibility that seems to relate to the extent to which the laws we create to protect the animals from harm are strong or not. Now, there are quite a few exceptions that I identify in the book and that I'm happy to discuss in more detail when we have Q&A. But as a general proposition, it seems to me fairly clear that when it comes to creating laws to protect the interests of animals, it's in the animal's best interest to be somewhat visible. And I think this is an issue, of course, when it comes to puppy farms. We've already discussed the issue of people buying their animals from a seemingly very respectable, clean environment and never actually seeing where the animal came from, and in particular where the breeding mother's living. So I think that visibility and how it pertains to the law is going to be something very important that we're going to discuss today. In addition to being an academic, I am also a kind of semi-retired animal advocate, and I have myself trespassed considerably in order to both bear witness to the way in which factory farmed animals live, and also to bring to the community's attention the way in which factory farmed animals live. So I've trespassed into places such as broiler sheds, battery cages, piggeries. I've never been to a puppy farm. I would do it if it wasn't for the fact that I'm now, unfortunately, an old lady. But I do think that everyone who joins us today and everyone who is interested in animal protection and using their legal skills to advance the cause of animal protection have multiple very important roles to play. And I think one of them is also working for and representing animal advocates when they do the important work of creating visibility in a situation in which the harm is being done in an out-of-sight private property context. But as I say, I'm happy to say more about that as we go through the session.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that about you, so that's very interesting. All right, so I thought now we might get stuck into some questions that have already been submitted. Now, these are really general questions for anyone on the panel who might like to respond. So please feel free to jump in. And if there are any questions that have been directed to a specific panelist, I will definitely ask that. So firstly, just generally speaking, are you guys aware of how big the puppy farming, problem really is in Australia? Do we have much idea about if it's worse in other states, for example?
I'm happy to kick off with that one, Erin. So we know that the puppy farming problem is really big, but we just don't know how big it is because of the inadequate laws to track and monitor puppy factories. That has changed considerably in Victoria because we have these legislation that requires you to register with council. To sell animals online, you have to have a individual ID on the pet exchange register, so we can really sort of track down any dodgy breeders or puppy farmers much easier than other states. But the puppy farming industry has always been underground and remains underground in still in Victoria. No legislation's perfect, and as Brett said, we do have a real problem with enforcement as well. There's a range of issues that happen when a charity is given the big job of enforcing a huge bit of legislation. But I guess in relation to if it's worse in other states, in our experience, what we're seeing is that it's really starting to worsen significantly at the moment in New South Wales. And that's because all these other states like Victoria, Western Australia, South Australia have made the moves or are making the moves to implement legislation. And because legislation can't be enacted at a federal level to combat puppy farms are relocating to the states with the worst animal welfare laws, which is New South Wales when it comes to puppy farms. So what we saw in Victoria was that this legislation came into effect, and puppy farmers that were impacted by it, a range of them did close down, but a lot of them just jumped the border and they got a permit to operate, on border towns. So an example is Murray River Council have been absolutely smashed with puppy farm applications, and some of the puppy farmers actually continue to live in Victoria, but will cross over the state border to run their puppy farm and to sell their puppies. So we have really big concerns when it comes to New South Wales, and we just think that we're going to see all this legislation come into effect in other places, and New South Wales is really going to condense as the puppy farming capital.
Yes, I can back that up with what I found in 2017 was I had a whole lot of inquiries from breeders, and it so turned out that they kept on moving to New South Wales. Now, what they also do is they have, to avoid legislation, they don't have the puppies on one site, and they don't have the fertile females rather on the one site. They'll spread them through a number of premises and not necessarily in the one state. And that's how they'll try to get around the laws and the requirements for code of practice requirements as well. And yes, certainly it was amazing how many fled to New South Wales, unfortunately. But I don't know anything about the scope, the frequency of puppy farming elsewhere in Australia. But in Victoria, just what seems to come up on my radar is there's still plenty of it going on, and it's very much rural based. It seems to be easier for people to fly under the radar of the pet exchange register when they're not so visible down here in Melbourne.
Mm. And can anyone tell us a bit more about what are the authorities doing about this? People like the RSPCA, for example, what is their involvement?
They have run a number of prosecutions, and they have been successful. I've seen quite a few of them. I've been approached by people who've been prosecuted by them. And however, I've noticed these people seem to crop up again. They pop up again later on. The same people who've been prosecuted, they pop up again and they just morph into another kind of business. And as Georgie Purcell was saying, they do have ways of keeping under the radar. And I do see that. There was one particular group I noticed that got prosecuted, went back up again, and I think they got prosecuted again. And I had a puppy farming matter where I prosecuted, and the woman who ran the puppy farm said to the court, oh, you know, I'm distressed, I've lost my livelihood, I'll never be able to do this again. Well, within weeks, she was back doing it again, starting up again, and got shut down again. But they're fairly determined.
I think that sort of touches on, you know, another issue that, you know, that Brett has raised is the reality is the punishment for operating a puppy farm anywhere in the country just isn't sufficient enough deterrent to, you know, stop them from trying again. Often they're just whacked with a fine that is, you know, the cost of selling 1 litter of puppies. Now, if you've got 50 dogs, you know, it's still worth the risk to continue to run your puppy farm and risk getting prosecuted. And, you know, when it comes to enforcement, as Erin initially asked, the RSPCA have, you know, a very important role to play when it comes to, you know, sheltering animals and adopting out animals. But we just think that it's time for the powers that they have under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act should be shared elsewhere. And we're very supportive of an independent Office of Animal Protection that is a lot you know, better funded, better resourced to actually get out there and to enforce these laws, because the RSPCA is a charity. They run mostly off public funding and some money off the government. And it does mean that they often have to make hard and difficult decisions about who they're going to prosecute, if they can prosecute. And it means that, you know, when there are puppy farms continuing to exist in states, even when there is legislation to stop them, it means that these puppy farmers are continuing to get away with it.
Yes, there used to be councils who would undertake these prosecutions. Notably, Casey Council and Wyndham Council did a few prosecutions each, and they put a lot of work into it. But I haven't seen them prosecuting in recent times. I think the cost of it became far too much, because what we need, as Ms. Purcell said, we need a dedicated office to enforcing the puppy farm legislation, a dedicated office rather than a body that has a number of functions and can choose to spread its resources and its funds in many different ways. And the problem with that is, for instance, with a council, the flavour of the month might be building regulations, and they therefore don't go ahead with a puppy farm prosecution that comes to their attention. The other problem is not a lot of the councils have the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals powers transferred to them. So not a lot of the councils can actually prosecute. But I think really the answer isn't to leave it to councils. They're really not resourced for this in so many ways. And the RSPCA has a number of functions. There's got to be a dedicated office to this, which is funded specifically for the purpose of dealing with puppy farms.
Yeah.
And in terms of the enforcement, the penalties, I should let you know what the penalties are. They look great on paper. We're talking about potential fines of hundreds of thousands for organisations and tens of thousands for people, but it never works out that way. The highest prosecution penalty I got was $50,000, but it was roughly $50,000, and roughly $30,000 of that was pound fees. So that and a couple other prosecutions got fines of close to $20,000, but really that's a drop in the ocean for these organisations, especially when they can string out the payment of that. With the problems with Fines Victoria over the last few years, the amount of time they're going to get to pay that is astronomical. And the problem that results in them not getting heavy penalties is that they're normally first-time offenders. They don't have records for other offences. And so you're not going to get a community corrections order for someone who's on a first offence. You will only get fines, and they'll normally start at the low level where it's a first-time offender.
If I might jump in and add a couple of reflections as well, is that okay? Yeah. So listening to people speaking and to my eminent colleagues on the panel, it's fascinating to me how connected so many of these issues are and how we see them playing out in so many different domains. So, for example, one of the trends that I've observed over the past kind of 5-10 years is that animal advocacy groups have tended to move away from lobbying politicians on issues, say, to do with intensive farming, animal agriculture, and instead focus their efforts on encouraging the community to think about perhaps not consuming these products, plant-based meals, that kind of thing. And so I think it's really interesting for us to also keep in mind the popularity of purpose-bred animals, of particular types of breeds of animals that are cosmetically spectacular. And also remember that perhaps there's work for animal advocates to do in terms of trying to change the community's mind on this, just the very suitability of even thinking that if you have a dog, your dog needs to look a particular way. Because we all know as animal advocates that if you're looking at a really cute, fluffy little white, beautiful dog, probably that dog's mother is suffering somewhere. So I think perhaps there are a range of things we can be doing simultaneously in order to help bring about change. Because I think, sadly, lawmakers are followers. They don't tend to lead. They're not out in front. When I was preparing for this presentation or for this panel, I was reflecting on a few things. And, I can remember in the year 2000, we had a very, very big action where we went into a big battery farm in Parkville. And we really felt in 2000 we might get a ban on the battery cage in Australia. Well, of course, probably every single person on this Zoom meeting knows that we do not have a ban on the battery cage. But what we do have is a change in consumer attitudes. So we need lots of different approaches, looking to set up an independent body, looking to increase penalties, looking to strengthen the law, but also, I think, trying to change community sentiment. Because as I say, my sense is that unfortunately lawmakers tend to follow, they're reluctant to lead in many cases.
Yeah, and you do raise a very good point. Just in terms of lawmakers, I've probably got a question for Georgie, actually, considering your role with Anti-Medic at the moment. At the moment, what do you think is sort of the current appetite under Daniel Andrews to set up any kind of independent office? Is it a bit of a pipe dream or is it something realistic?
Look, we used to think it was a pipe dream for sure, and then in our first term, our first year of Parliament, there was an inquiry into the impact of animal rights activism in Victoria, which was set up by the National MP in the upper house with us. And that was set up to investigate ways to, I guess, criminalise and punish animal activists. And we're seeing what's called, you're probably all familiar with them, ag-gag laws come into effect all around the country, and Victoria was one of the only places not doing them. So we got Andy on the committee as a member and made sure that we made the case about why activists are actually doing this work, and the fact that if we actually had stronger animal welfare laws and stronger animal protection, then activists wouldn't feel compelled to actually do this work and to show the public what's going on. And in an amazing turn of events, the recommendations of the report actually came back with a range of recommendations about how we can improve animal welfare to stop the need for activists to do this work. And one of them was the state government was going to recommend an independent Office of Animal Protection to the federal government. So they wrote to the federal government and said, this is something that we need to do, but we're still pushing for it at a state level in the meantime. As a little halfway point, as part of the puppy farm legislation, we got a brand new government body set up called Animal Welfare Victoria, and they're tasked with doing a range of different bits of work, like implementing new regulations when it comes to animals. They're currently undertaking a whole review of our Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. So that hasn't been updated in Victoria for about 30 years. And that's going to be chucked out, and we're getting a brand new one called the Animal Welfare Act. So there has been a fair bit of work, I guess, going on to get us closer to the stage of an independent office. But I do think that if it does ever happen, it will happen at a federal level, because it just becomes, you know, as you probably picked up from this conversation, it just becomes far too messy to implement animal welfare legislation at a state level, because it's just so vastly different everywhere you go.
Yeah, it's interesting. Got a pretty general question. It's almost philosophical, but it's based in really very real considerations. To our panel, do you think that it's ever really ethical to buy from a breeder knowing that there are so many dogs in shelters? Because obviously we've touched on the fact that consumers do want certain things. What do you think about the ethics of those things?
I'm happy to share my thoughts. I myself do think that it is deeply morally problematic to purposely breed animals, particularly when there are perfectly lovely dogs at pounds waiting for homes, and particularly when we're in this situation where we know that dogs at pounds are put down. I was recently brought to heel by the RSPCA when I wrote quite a scathing opinion piece about buying animals, and they pointed out that in actual fact there are not as many dogs at pounds and dogs being put down at pounds as there once was. I do, however, worry about what a post-COVID world is going to look like in terms of whether all the people who have acquired dogs in the last 18 months are going to give those dogs the 15, 20 years that they need. But I do think there is something deeply problematic about breeding animals when other animals are in need of a home. That said, there is a turn within the political scholarship community among political scientists to try to move away from thinking in terms of a perfect world and rather trying to deal with the reality of what's on the ground. And I think perhaps people who subscribe to that school of thought that, you know, we are in an imperfect world, so let's just try and think about how we deal with that imperfection. I would say it seems to me that people are very keen on having particular types of dogs. It's become very socially acceptable. When I was a child, having a Muttley was a very common thing. It's not anymore. So if we do live in that reality where people have this preference for particular aesthetics in their dogs, then I think it's incumbent on us to ensure that the animals, if they are bred in the most satisfactory and ethical way possible. And often that means fighting hard to protect the breeding mother.
So I guess from my own personal perspective, I would, you know, I'd never buy a dog from a breeder. I never have. Grew up in a family where we always went to the shelter and adopted dogs. I now have 3 puppy farm rescues that were surrendered as a result of Victoria's legislation. And I really like to use them examples of that you actually can still get these designer breeds without having to buy from a breeder or from a puppy farmer. So I have a sausage dog and 2 Cavaliers. But you know, we know that there's a heap of dogs that continue to be killed in pounds and shelters around Victoria. It's actually something that we're doing in Andy's office now, trying to change that. We've got an inquiry, a task force underway at the moment. But on the other hand, I'm also pragmatic and a realist, and I know that there are going to be people who want puppies, and there are going to be people who want puppies of a particular breed. So through Oscar's Law, we always recommend adoption as a first option, and to advise people that getting a dog is a big decision, and you shouldn't be able to get a dog immediately. There shouldn't be dogs, you know, you shouldn't wake up one day and decide you want a dog and get one the next day or even that week. So we give people the tools that they need to understand how to spot a puppy farmer or a dodgy breeder, and to help them understand that, you know, going to a reputable registered breeder will often require things like waiting lists that can be up for 6 months to a year. And also a good breeder will actually care just as much about the home that you are going to give their dog as you care that they're ethical. And anything less than that means, you know, that you're probably supporting a business that is dodgy. And the other thing that we would say is that we're very, very, very concerned about the rise of these oodle breeds. Before we heard the word mutt, which is exactly the word that we're trying to bring back. All dogs are great, but these oodle breeds are, you know, they're not a real breed of dog, and they cannot be bred by anyone who's, you know, not some sort of dodgy backyard breeder or a puppy farmer, because there is no registered breeder of dogs that are crossbreeds. So, you know, it's something that we always sort of advise people to look out for, that if you are set on getting an oodle breed, that really the best case to go is to get a purebred poodle, or to go through a rescue group that rescues these dogs, because the chances are if you're after one of those crossbreed oodles that are rising in popularity, they're probably not going to have a very happy mother somewhere.
Yeah, we've had a couple of oodle type dogs come through the clinic, and we've had a lot of those French bulldogs come through as well. They seem to be very popular and also very sick. So yeah, that's been extremely heartbreaking to hear about. We did touch on earlier, actually, Malcolm, did you have a question? I think you raised your hand on Zoom.
It was an accident.
Oh, okay, thank you. Just earlier, we were talking a little bit about, you know, protecting mother dogs in these situations, because that's the reality we're talking about as of today, isn't it? There is a demand. Because we're looking at an audience here of mostly law students, really, and people who are really interested in the intricacies of the law. Can someone tell me a bit more about what happened in Victoria in 2017 when we brought in this new legislation? We always hear about great new laws that were passed. Can you guys give us an overview of what actually changed?
I can kick that one off, because Oscars Law was one of the key stakeholders on the legislation, so we helped to write it with the government. One thing that we learned at the start of this process was, after we got the commitment, was that no bit of legislation is going to completely ban puppy farming anywhere, and that's because it's really impossible to define what a puppy farm is in legislation without shutting down all breeding. So what we found as a solution was to basically find a way to restrict puppy farms into not existing in Victoria. And that was done by putting a cap on the amount of breeding dogs that any one breeder can have. So the legislation was supposed to be 10, but then what we found was the legislation was not going to pass with a hostile crossbench, and there had to be given an exemption for up to 50 with a with ministerial exemption off the Minister for Agriculture. So that requires things like yearly checks by the Chief Veterinary Officer and things like that. Thankfully, not many people have actually applied for the exemption. We're finding that they're relocating, as I mentioned earlier. So 10 breeding dogs still doesn't sound great, but in our experience, there have been puppy farms with 10 dogs. But in our experience, in our investigative work, because we also run the undercover investigations to expose these industries, was that most puppy farms had a minimum of 30. Some of them had up to 350 dogs. So by taking away the majority of the dogs that they could breed with, it basically meant puppy farming was not going to be a viable business model for them here in Victoria. The other thing that we did was shut down the range of ways that they could sell their puppies and deceive the public without them knowing they're from puppy farms. So the main one for that was banning the sale of puppies in pet shops. And, you know, most people didn't realise, but that was completely legal and remains completely legal everywhere else except Victoria right now. and you'd see this puppy in the window, and you know the pet shop would tell you they're from a reputable breeder, but they had nothing to prove for it. But people would really fall into that impulse buy, and pet shops were having no problem selling these puppies. So now what's in place in Victoria is they can no longer sell puppies, but we sort of spun it in a positive way, and they can have adoption days with rescue groups. So we've got this really good model now where rescue groups go in with their puppies and kittens, and they hold adoption days in the stores instead. The main thing that came into place with online sales, which is our biggest challenge now, is there was just no traceability of that at all. So, you know, you could have one puppy farmer selling dogs on Gumtree or Trading Post under 10 different names, and there was no way to prove who they were, where the dogs were coming from. So now to sell animals online in Victoria, you need a ID on the Pet Exchange Register. You can't make up an ID, you have to upload 100 points of ID. They've got a system to show that you're not uploading, you know, a fake license or a fake passport. So now Animal Welfare Victoria, who monitors the Pet Exchange Register, can see if there's someone selling, you know, 100 puppies a year, and head out to the premises, you know, where they're registered under, and actually see if they're breaking this legislation. So that's been a really important change as well. And that's basically the model that's coming into place in WA and hopefully South Australia as well.
Yes, they're the main changes, and they are very good. But the problem is that what I've seen is a number of breeders find ways to get around this still. The smaller breeders have just opted to get out of the whole registration system, be that the Pet Exchange registration or the Domestic Animals Business registration, and they do run this underground. And we've got these breeders who have 6 fertile females at one venue, 4 at another, 6 at another, and they shift them around, and you never really know how many they've actually got. There've been some pretty bad cases of that, and you never know who is actually supporting them. In fact, in a council, I've had some nasty situations with that, but that's how they try to get around the system, by shifting the fertile females around and having lots of different venues that no one ever knows about, unfortunately.
Yeah. Now, we've talked a little bit about the law itself. I've got a question here that is specifically for Siobhan. In some of your work, you've suggested that one of the ways that we might respond to animal suffering is to be consistent in how we create laws for animals. Now, this is obviously taking, you know, a higher level approach from your academic background, but can you take us through that and what that kind of thing would mean for puppy farms?
Yes, we've landed in this really fascinating place when it comes to puppy farms, because in one sense, you know, dogs are the animals with whom we often have the greatest connection, and it's the animal that often lives in our home. Or the research suggests that people increasingly consider dogs and other companion animals to be loved members of the family. We've seen things such as natural disasters in which the authorities are trying to evacuate people and they refuse to leave without their companion animals. And so we're talking about really treasured members of the family. Yet at the same time, we have this system in place whereby people are able to produce these animals in terrible conditions. So in my research, one of the things I've suggested is that we think about demanding that we be consistent in the way we create our laws, and that we don't have better laws for some kinds of animals and poorer laws for others. So, for example, we have very strong laws that protect animals when they are performing as part of TV shows, for example. So if a dog is going to appear in a commercial, there's a lot of very strong laws that will protect them in that way. But if a bird is in a battery cage, in a breeding facility, or perhaps in a factory farm, they're not well protected. So one of the things I suggest we do is we think about demanding consistency. We think about not allowing a situation where we can have animals who suffer in one kind of context and are well protected in another. But it does land us in this very tricky place when it comes to this issue of puppy farms, because again, we have perhaps the most privileged of animals being treated in appalling ways. So one of the things we could do perhaps pragmatically is perhaps try to swing the conversation on puppy farms around to perhaps encouraging people to think of it more as an agricultural practice, to move away from the kind of the language of companion animals and more towards the language of factory farming. We know, for example, that if you walk into a supermarket, it's very hard to find eggs on the shelf that are from a battery farm, and that's the good work of animal advocates. Yet at the same time, it's very easy to walk into a pet store and buy a little puppy who we know has been perhaps bred in a puppy mill. So we're in this really interesting conceptual place where we've moved the conversation around in some ways that are positive for some animals, and meanwhile, the most cherished animal is being left behind. So, I don't know, what am I saying? Theoretically, could there be some value in us trying to encourage people to think of puppy mills as part of the animal industrial complex or part of the intensive agricultural sector? Could that work? Could that perhaps get people thinking in creative ways that warn them against helping to facilitate this suffering? Because of course, as we know, most people probably really do love their dog and do not wish to know that the mother is suffering back at the puppy mill. But how do we convey that? And so that's just one conceptual tool that perhaps might get people thinking in creative ways as we try to, as we've already discussed, get the community on board so the politicians will have no choice but to follow.
Georgie, just on that, actually, that was just sort of had me thinking, your role is sort of split between a political sphere and an advocacy sphere. Do you have any thoughts on your kind of external comms and like what sort of appetite you think the public would have to change and how long that would take? How do we really change consumer demands with this kind of this industry of cute dogs?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because I think if you asked basically anyone if they're opposed to puppy farms, they would say yes, but puppy farmers continue to thrive, you know, everywhere in the country, because often when it comes down to it, people are opposed to these things, but can, you know, tend to make personal exceptions, or obviously are tricked or fooled by the dodgy breeders and the puppy farmers and are simply unaware that they're buying from a puppy farm. I think something that we really need to change the narrative on when it comes to puppy farms is that often people will knowingly buy from a puppy farm or a dodgy breeder, but they think that they're helping the puppy to be freed or to have, you know, a better life. But the reality is it's a breeding females, and it's the stud dogs on the puppy farms that are, you know, condemned to a life of suffering. You know, basically they're born there and they die there. And we need to help people understand that actually every single purchase that's made from a puppy farm, you know, condemns these dogs to, you know, longer suffering and longer imprisonment on those farms. I think something that's really important that came into place in Victoria is actually the education piece from the government about, you know, explaining to people what is a puppy farm, how to avoid a puppy farm, because I really do believe that the majority of consumers do want to do the right thing, and they don't want to support puppy farms, but often, you know, these personal exceptions are made, or they feel like there's no other way to get a puppy, or, you know, they just don't even realise that they're doing it. So I think the largest amount of work is in that public education space now that we've got the legislative change, and we need to work on the enforcement and we need to work on the education piece.
And I know, at least from the clinic experience that I've got right now, most people who come to us are buying their dogs online. So they're buying them on Gumtree and Trading Post. Do you guys think that or I suppose really this is again a question for Oscars Law and the AJP. Do you think that there's any appetite realistically from the government to work in that space, targeting the fact that animals are sold online? You know, can they make public statements about this kind of thing, about Gumtree specifically facilitating this massive amount of sales, selling dogs for, you know, $10,000 for a French bulldog kind of thing? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. So we actually explored, as part of the legislation, banning online sales because it was such a problem. And we ran into this problem that if you banned online sales, you completely prevent the ability for rescue groups to operate online as well. So sites like Pet Rescue or shelters and things like that wouldn't be able to advertise their dogs online and to arrange that adoption process through the internet. So something that we actually picked up on after the legislation passed was that with this pet exchange register in place, where you have to, it's illegal to not display your pet exchange register ID on Gumtree or Trading Post. We found that heaps of people still weren't doing it or were making it up. And we actually got the government to pass a regulation on top of the legislation that held Gumtree and Trading Post and all those sites liable if it wasn't on there. It was coming, initially it was just on the puppy farmer, and we know that puppy farmers don't really care about the law. So when we switched it and, you know, made actually the online sellers accountable as well, we saw a real change and immediately. So, you know, if anyone here ever sees an ad from Victoria that doesn't have that unique breeder ID on it, you can actually report it and Gumtree will take it down within minutes, because after they just got slapped with a few fines, you could see that they didn't want it to continue to happen. I don't think that the government, I guess to answer your initial question, Erin, I don't think the government has too much of an appetite on any more work in that space. But what is interesting is that the online sellers seem to be quite interested. You know, we saw Facebook ban the online sale of animals, you know, quite a few years ago now. And I think that Trading Post and Gumtree are really concerned with the reputation of what's being sold online and want to be ethical. So, you know, we've had a range of conversations you know, about getting in contact with them and actually seeing if they will change their own policy to not allow the sale of dogs from, you know, dodgy breeders or puppy farmers. There's been some small changes. So you can now not sell an animal on Gumtree unless you're registered with an applicable dog breeding organisation. Unfortunately, they're pretty easy to join. So a bunch of dodgy breeders then join the applicable organisations, but there have been some changes in place. Ultimately, we would like to just be able to see, you know, the rescue groups and the adoptions online though. So we'll keep working on it.
Yeah. I think my next question is for Brett specifically. So you've told us a little bit about the fact that you have experience prosecuting puppy farms. Can you give us kind of a general insight into what's involved in that? How does that start? And just maybe an example of a case would be great.
Well, normally there's a complaint from a member of the public. Well, quite often there's a complaint from a member of the public that they've bought a dog and it's not fit for sale, and that somehow filters over to council, or they make the complaint directly to council. Then council actually finds the place. They track down where the person is operating from and they investigate there, and they'll get a warrant to search inside the premises, and they'll then find the numerous breaches. If there's no complaint from a member of the public, it's pretty easy for them to avoid detection. Then sometimes weird things happen. There was one prosecution that arose from a puppy farmer who was burning off an enormous amount of just general stuff, and a member of the public complained about the smoke. Council went down there and found, lo and behold, there was this huge puppy farm going on there with about 500 unregistered dogs, or something extraordinary like that. No, it wasn't 500, it was about 200 unregistered dogs. And he'd been operating for something like 30 years without anyone knowing he was actually there, any prosecutorial agency knowing it was there. That's how they start those prosecutions often. Sometimes it will be that the council just goes in and actually does a proper audit for once, and instead of just ticking it off, some sensible council officer actually decides that she or he will go and investigate the property properly. I've seen that with cat farming happening. People aren't so aware of the cat farming problem, and so I think the councils and maybe the RSPCA don't quite take it as seriously, and the cat farmers go on for many, many years before finally there's a proper audit and they find the various problems. And so similarly with the puppy farming, then there are masses of breaches of the Domestic Animals Act by way of breaches of codes of practice.
And then the council will prosecute under the Domestic Animals Act.
Or under POCTA.
Or under POCTA,
Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, yes.
Yeah, and then in your experience, is the RSPCA Vic involved in the POCTA side of that prosecution as well consistently?
Sometimes. I can remember one prosecution where the RSPCA came in with us to actually bust open the operation, and the police were involved as well. Normally the police will be involved, but yes, certainly RSPCA has been involved in some of those. And then the harder part is prosecuting the POCTA offences. It's much harder to prove those offences than the Domestic Animals Act offences. And largely the RSPCA, if they're involved, they will lead the actual operation on the premises. But most of the time, the ones I've been involved in haven't involved the RSPCA, they've just involved the police as well as the council.
So we're talking about the Domestic Animals Act, we're talking about POCTA. Some of the work that our organisation is doing is around prosecuting, if you like, or suing breeders who are doing the wrong thing, and we're using the consumer law to take it a different way. Yeah. Can you, Brett, or the others, do you have any other sorts of thoughts, high-level thoughts really around the other legal avenues that either the authorities or individuals could have against puppies or puppy farms, breeders?
Well, yes, Australian consumer law. Certainly I've used that in relation to disputes with breeders, but I can't think of anything else outside the Domestic Animals Act and the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act that is used. Sometimes some pressure will be brought to bear on them in terms of building prosecution, strangely enough. That can affect them, but they're the main pieces of legislation.
Yeah, that's our thought as well. Just wanted to raise that. So I've got another sort of general question for everyone. Because we are speaking to an audience that is mostly made up of law students, I guess I wanted to see, do you guys have any suggestions for law students, people who are at probably the start of their careers, who want to help stop puppy farming or even just get more involved in animal protection or animal law in general? Do you have any suggestions or thoughts for them?
In terms of getting involved in animal law, they really need to get a broad general basis of understanding of the law. There are a whole lot of issues that affect animal law, and they can be, strangely enough, contract issues, they can be personal injury issues, they can be administrative law and criminal law, and they're the main areas if you want to practice in animal law. In terms of protection, it is largely criminal law. There's a bit of administrative law involved, but I wouldn't advise people to be going straight into practicing animal law in their first few years of practice. They'll find that it is beyond them. I've had a number of problems arise from actually even senior criminal practitioners who have handled a dog matter, and because they haven't known other areas of law, because that's all they've done, criminal law, they've missed the personal injury aspect, they've missed the insurance aspect that has resulted in potential claims against them. You've got to make sure you know the areas of law other than just criminal law. It's not just about criminal law, the protection of animals and animal law. It's about those other areas as well.
I would probably say, from my perspective, is considering sort of all options that you want to explore, I guess, your interest in animal law. So I'm really interested at the political level and, you know, the legislative change level. I'm not a lawyer. Actually, I found out 3 days ago that I'm a fit and proper person. So I am going to be a lawyer in a couple of months. But I finished my law degree 10 years ago and never got admitted to practice. Sorry, I started 10 years ago. I finished it 5 years ago. But I've still found sort of my interest and my study area in law really applicable at the political level and in terms of, you know, policy change and things like that. The other bit of advice I would say is to look at organisations that you could potentially volunteer with. So, for example, Oscars Law has had to call on the Animal Law Institute a range of times when we've been, we often get sent letters for defamation by puppy farmers. They've written letters for me, they've written letters for my colleague Deb, and, you know, there's a range of sort of ways that you can help different organisations with little bits and pieces without actually practicing in the area, and often that there's skills that you're applying in another area of law, but just, you know, relating to an animal welfare organisation. So I would definitely sort of look into the groups in your area that you might be able to give some time to help expand your interest in your practice in the animal law space if you weren't sure about actually practicing in it.
I would suggest a range of things. If your law firm is in a position to undertake pro bono work, you might suggest pro bono work that could be of benefit to animals, and that might include working with animal groups and animal advocates. I think as lawyers, you're also highly likely to be very articulate, persuasive. You're going to perhaps be in a privileged position. So just simply using your ability to express complex ideas in persuasive and articulate ways can be a great service to the animals. I also think that, as we've already discussed, the people who go into these invisible places in order to make them more visible do need lawyers as well. So being open to acting for the animal advocates is another thing that you can do to support animals. And of course, there's also always a lot of grunt work to be done for animal charities and animal protection organisations. So I think if you are somebody with legal training who wants to do something positive for animals, I think there are plenty of opportunities. And if you're not certain the best way that you might be of service, then perhaps chatting to even an organisation such as Voiceless, which has done a lot for animal law, you'll be able to, I think, identify opportunities and ways in which you can be useful.
That's some really good points. Okay, I have a couple more questions left, but before we move on, Chelsea, did you have your hand up just a moment ago?
No, sorry, I was doing the clap reaction for Georgie getting fit and proper.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. I do have another question for Siobhan, specifically relating to some of your previous work. Now, earlier in the session today, you've mentioned that you argue that an animal's level of visibility to the community will assist in terms of the animal receiving better legal protections from harm. But obviously that doesn't really fit with puppy farms at the moment because puppies are highly visible and they're not being protected. Can you tell us more about that theory and just why you think that's the case?
Yeah, look, I think I feel as though we have really already in the things that we've discussed covered off a lot of the key issues. So I'll just be very brief because I think probably the audience already has a really good sense of what I'm going to say. But you know, we've already discussed that, in my view, lawmakers really are followers, and that we need to find a way we've got to find a way to make the community engaged and interested. And one of the ways in which they can be engaged and interested is via visibility. And that's often to do with relationships, knowing the animals. But we do have this very particular challenge. We have got these animals that live in our homes that we often adore, yet the mother and perhaps also the father that brought them into the world are suffering in invisible places. So we have got a lot of work to do, but we've already heard that there are good people trying hard to do this work, but they're always on the move. And so we too have to be nimble and creative. And, you know, one of the things that was coming to my mind earlier when we were talking about councils and the way in which councils can create laws that perhaps could be beneficial in terms of shutting down factory farms, you know, I beg your pardon, puppy mills. You know, animal advocates for a long time have looked to council to try and deal with the problem of animals in circuses, trying to use their ownership of the kind of land that you need in order to set up a circus to create change there. So I think this is a really, it's a tricky problem, and it's a tricky problem because it is hidden. We need visibility, we need discussion, and we need to be nimble and respond quickly and to keep at it. And, you know, and to hear the speakers describing that breeders are moving to New South Wales because those laws are weaker than other jurisdictions, I think that again speaks to the need to be nimble and responsive, but also the need to increase awareness and visibility. I live in New South Wales. I was unaware that this is happening in my state. And how would I know? The system is designed to ensure that I don't. So, yeah, so I don't really have much more to add on that. I think we're doing a good job articulating the problem. And I think we have some ideas about how to create change. But of course, we all know that change is so very hard to achieve. We've got to push against any door that we think will open for us and be creative and nimble.
Yeah. All right. Are there any other sort of final questions from anyone who's currently on this call? You can pop questions into the chat or you can raise your hand. Joseph Waters, you've raised your actual hand. Would you like to speak?
Thanks so much, everyone, for the presentation so far. I've really enjoyed it. Never had such a presentation that's made me think so much. So part of what you guys have been talking about is like the fact that there's low fines. It seems from what you've been saying that people aren't put in prison. It seems like from what you've been saying that it's not actually the DPP, the Department of Prosecution, or the police that prosecute this. It's more like councils. So, you know, like in an effort to try and make, for instance, fines bigger or potentially people to get prison sentences, I'm just wondering, like, first of all, if that is something that you would argue in a policy sense when you, when you're arguing to try and, for instance, make fines higher or make someone get is that something that you argue? And then I guess, like, how do those arguments go down? I imagine people would say, oh, it's ridiculous. How could you possibly, it's too disproportionate to put someone in prison just for harming a dog, and this is ridiculous, like, so how do those arguments go down? How do you combat them in terms of like the sentience of an animal, the fact that they suffer, scientific research and that kind of stuff?
Well, I think there's one glaring disparity. A reptile farmer will go to jail. Puppy farmer won't. Simple as that. I don't understand why there's a difference. Reptile farmers go to jail for quite some time. They're reptile traders, but they're breeding them in horrible conditions, and then they put them in horrible conditions when they stuff them in socks, wrap them up with cord and stick them in a fry pan to ship to wherever, that kind of thing, or freight to wherever. They get incredibly heavy penalties, and I'm not quite sure why the puppy farming doesn't quite seem to fit that bill. It's very strange.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Joseph, and we would definitely support stronger penalties because in our experience, like puppy farmers are organised just like we're organised. They talk among each other, they share with each other, you know, the penalties that they receive, and because they're not ever sufficient enough, it doesn't act as any deterrent to stop, you know, to stop the others who might not have been caught yet. We would, at the minimum, love to see higher fines, like a fine sort of proportionate, I guess, to the profit that they're making from the puppies, rather than, you know, just a couple of $1,000s and a banning order. But the other thing, I guess, that we are quite interested in is that often abuse to animals is an early warning sign to more serious crimes that can flow on from that, which obviously have more serious penalties. So we actually think if there was tougher penalties, you know, to act as a deterrent when it comes to cruelty to animals, we'd actually probably see, you know, a drop in crimes, you know, that escalate from cruelty to animals as well. But yeah, I mean, in Victoria, we've never seen a puppy farmer go to jail. In fact, we've never seen a puppy farmer go to jail anywhere. Or if they've gone to jail, they've gone to jail for another crime. And, you know, until I guess the matter of animal cruelty in general is seen as a serious crime, whether it's puppy farming or something else, I think that the laws just aren't going to change. So I think it's that public perception change that we spoke about earlier as well.
Yes, unfortunately, there aren't even any cases I'm aware of where a community corrections order has been imposed. There are very few offences under the Domestic Animals Act that can have a community corrections order, unfortunately. And similarly, under POCTA, it's incredibly rare to even have a community corrections order imposed, but they're just not imposed. And yet you see what certainly I would see as far less serious crimes outside the animal sphere getting community corrections orders and getting jail. It's just there's an enormous amount more value put on humans and something done to a human or something done to a human's money than the value on an animal's life. And that comes back to the whole genesis of the law, which was to protect property owners and to protect wealth. And we're still stuck in that kind of thinking in law. And unfortunately, we're not equating the harm that is caused to an animal to the harm that is caused to a human, for instance.
I think as well, it sort of made me think about when you said the word property, Brett, but a big problem, I think, when it comes to animal protection laws is that they are considered property. So, you know, when an animal is got, you know, no sort of more legal standing or protection than a table or a chair, we will continue to see like really woeful laws and not serious punishments, I guess, for cruelty to them. So a big part of what we would like to see is actually sort of changing that definition of what is an animal. To most of us, especially our companion animals, are not property, they're companions, they're family members. So I guess a start is we're legislating sentience in Victoria. So animals will be considered sentient under our new animal welfare legislation. But we don't know what that looks like or what it actually means when it comes down to, you know, how legislation is applied yet.
If I might just add perhaps a slightly different perspective, or it's not even necessarily a slightly different perspective, but perhaps just a thought that we need to keep in mind, or not even we need to, that I suggest perhaps might be worthwhile us keeping in mind. I do worry a little bit about too much emphasis on punishment, because I do worry that that can perhaps inadvertently lead us down a path where people who are perhaps disadvantaged, people of colour, First Nations people find themselves being incarcerated at a greater rate. I am not someone who is intuitively really comfortable with pressing for greater incarceration and more stronger punishment. I'm absolutely opposed to animal suffering, and I'm not somebody who supports the breeding of companion animals, especially in puppy mills. But I just want to leave that little word of warning that if we are to advocate for this position, we need to be mindful of other things that perhaps intersect in important ways, such as poverty and disadvantage and people who are unable to represent themselves adequately at court, etc. We don't want the rich, sophisticated people getting away with it and those who are not in a position to do so actually being the ones that are prosecuted and perhaps incarcerated.
Yeah. Sorry, Malcolm. Hi. We can't hear you right now.
Done. Georgia and Siobhan have just raised two important questions. The last year and a half have been informative for me because I've been running prosecutions, albeit here in Little Tasmania. Responding to Georgia, one of the most important tools I've seen is the banning order. Magistrates have been very reluctant to impose severe penalties, and that'll bring me to something that Siobhan has just touched on, which is really good. But notwithstanding that, magistrates are willing to ban people for long periods of time, up to and including life. And if you are a bad puppy farmer, that's going to put you out of business. We mustn't forget that. And Siobhan raised a very important point that we don't, I mean, I certainly personally don't want to stand in the court and punish the, let's be blunt about it, the sad people in the main that I see there. Now, I'm not talking about puppy farmers. The only prosecutions I've run that have involved breeding have been backyard breeders. And they've fallen into that category that Siobhan identifies, as have all the people I've prosecuted. They're sad, I'll be blunt about it, they're sad people. And I'll stand up in front of the magistrate and say, I don't want revenge. But what I do want is, first of all, the message to get out there that the practice is unacceptable. And secondly, a ban, because it's too easy to have an animal if we leave the farmers aside. And we seem only at the moment to be talking about pet animals. So the fact of the matter is that there are a hell of a lot of people out there who just shouldn't have pets. It's as simple as that. Now, my limited experience, it's Tasmanian, so it's pretty low level, folks, is I don't see hesitation from magistrates on that score. That they won't give big fines. The last year and a half, it's been in the range of a couple of $100 to $3,000, and the 3,000 was the exception. The median value is probably $1,000, and frankly, it's a waste of time in any case, because the defendant pays it off at $40 a fortnight. So, you know, good focus there from Georgia. Thank you. Banning orders, really important. And good focus from Siobhan. Thank you. You know, we don't want to be howling for blood, because these are really unfortunate people in the main, other than the big puppy farmers. The last thing I'll say there, without naming names, is, to my sure and certain knowledge, I can't say numbers, but the puppy farmer brackets, closed brackets in Tasmania are being closely monitored on a regular basis under a power that exists in the Tasmanian Animal Welfare Act to randomly inspect animal operations which are being run on a commercial basis, and that's been interpreted very widely by the enforcement authorities who pay my salary. God, hard to believe that. But believe me, they are being monitored and very, very closely watched. But I would caution against automatically jumping. I'd be interested to hear what Georgie especially and Brett have to say about this, jumping to the conclusion that the laws are inadequate. The only, and I'm going to shut up in a second, the only inadequacy of the law on our side that I can identify is if you're looking at the poor breeding bitch, the difficulty of enforcing the law about number of pregnancies, simply in terms of record keeping and tied to a particular individual dog. So I'd be interested in what you have to say about that. Enough said. Thank you.
First thing, thanks very much for that, Malcolm. That was really interesting to hear that banning orders are being imposed without great reluctance in Tasmania. Sadly, in Victoria, we argue for them. We really try hard. And because they're first-time offenders, unless it's a really egregious example, we'll find that the magistrate refuses the order, which, as you say, is rightly the most important tool. So unfortunately, we're not having quite the same success as you are in terms of banning orders. In terms of the law's inadequacies, I'm not so concerned about the actual law being inadequate. It's the enforcement of it and the application of it in the magistrate's court where it is normally dealt with. That's what I'm more concerned about. That's our real problem. And the ability of the breeders to do things like, avoiding the legislation. It's very hard to stop them doing this. There are a lot of cases of breeders who are set up in New South Wales. They're selling dogs in Victoria and they sell them through an intermediary. And you don't know that you're buying the dog from New South Wales in the first place. They're being creative. They're working hard at ways to get around the selling problems and the pet register. And as I think Georgie mentioned once before, they don't bother about putting the ID on. I haven't done a prosecution of someone who's failed to put an ID on an online advertisement for a while, but certainly I came across them. And, that's just no concern to them. They get a couple $100 fine for that.
I think the first thing I want to say is thanks, Siobhan, for your comments about punishments. I think it's a really important point to make because there's definitely sort of a grey area when it comes to this issue. We've worked in a range of cases that were reported to us as puppy farmers and turned out to actually just be hoarders. And, all they actually needed was help. And so, we've worked with them to actually move on the animals and get them into rescue groups and get the people the help and the support that they need. So I do think it is a really important point about, how can we, deter people from this cruelty without, creating a bigger problem or impacting, marginalised or disadvantaged groups. So thank you for saying those. To echo what Brett said and to answer Malcolm, my concern in Victoria, it isn't the law being weak, it's the enforcement of the law and I guess on ways that we can improve that. In fact, the legislation's great, but the problem is when, there is a example of it being breached that can't be acted on, that's our concern. So, we make a range of reports that just unfortunately can't be followed up on because of resources. And I guess when it comes to weak laws, my biggest concern is New South Wales. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act is much weaker than a lot of the other states. In fact, you can't even seize dogs from puppy farms there. So if a puppy farm is operating illegally without a permit, there's cruelty going on, the majority of the time the dogs can't actually be seized. So here in Victoria, if there was an illegal puppy farm operating before we had this legislation, the RSPCA could go in and take every single dog. In New South Wales, RSPCA prosecutors will find a puppy farm, go in, log the breaches, but they can't even leave with the dogs. So, the dogs remain in this place up until it reaches a court, which, as we all know, can take a long, long time. So, that's probably, I guess, to answer that, that's why our biggest focus right now is New South Wales, because we think they have the biggest room to move. And then, yeah, where there is existing legislation that is good, just working on ways that it can be better enforced.
Thank you, guys. Well, we're pretty much at time now. So I think I would just like to wrap up today's session and to really extend a big thank you to our panelists, Georgie, Brett and Siobhan. This was really good. Yes, everyone put yourselves off mute and give us a hand. Yeah, okay, no. Thank you everybody else for joining today. I know that it's a very long day. You've all been working around the clock for this moot. We look forward to seeing you all bright and early tomorrow for your 4th preliminary round, and then on to the semi-finals and grand finals as well. Yes, all right. So have a great night, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and good luck with the rest of it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good luck with it.
Bye.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
everyone.